All right. Welcome to our first of hopefully just two videos on the introduction to classification. So your guiding question that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this is, what is classification? Hopefully this is all sort of familiar from middle school. Being high school, we're going to go a little more in depth than you have before, but some of these should be terms that you've seen before. So our objectives, we're going to review some of the history of classification. So history is so important when you're studying ideas because in order to understand where we are, we need to know where we've come from. So science is about building on ideas, building on the research and the work of others. So in order to understand modern classification, you have to understand previous classification. Our second objective, we're going to learn about what is the Linnaean system of classification and how is it different from modern classification. Third, what is binomial nomenclature? Nice Latin term perhaps we have come across in middle school. We'll break it apart, talk about what it means. And number four, we're going to talk about how to read and interpret the taxa. Again, taxa, maybe not a term you've come across, but once you start seeing the terms I'm going to categorize under there, it'll come back to you quickly. So the first thing, the history of classification. Classification is as old as humans because it's part of our nature, human nature, to classify. So when early man looked out and he saw wolves and he saw mushrooms and trees and fish and bees, he was able to recognize that these things grew and they were alive. And they were also able to easily recognize that they were different. So classification, your brain is wired in order to categorize things. So classification is really one of the most natural sciences. The original classifier is a Greek philosopher and poet and historian and scientist named Aristotle. Now, Aristotle lived way back, 382 to 322 BCE, so that is before zero. And what Aristotle did was he was one of the first people to really write about classifying organisms. And he classified them in a way that's going to seem strange, but if you follow his logic, makes sense. So he created two groups. He had animals with blood and animals without blood. Now, when he was talking about animals with blood, what he really meant was mammals, things that give live birth. And when you think about the fact that it's ancient Greece, he probably would have been around farm animals, so sheep, cows, things like that, that when they give birth, you notice that they are live birth, so he would have seen blood. Now, animals without blood, these would have been your egg-laying animals. So, for example, a chicken lays an egg, no blood. So these were the two categories of animals that he created. Sort of makes sense, but now we sort of obviously know that there's a lot more in-depth way to classify animals than this. One of the coolest things that he did was he created the first hierarchy. So a hierarchy is where you start out with sort of lesser beings, and then you go up, and there are sort of the higher beings at the top. Now, we have a hierarchy, a modern hierarchy of classification as well, but he came up with the original one, and he called it the ladder of intellect. So he contributed in that way to this hierarchical, that's a fun word to say, hierarchical system of classification. The father of modern classification, though, is a man named Carolus Linnaeus, or as he was born, Carl von Linné. Carolus Linnaeus was a name bestowed upon him later in life because of the system that he created. He was born in 1707, died 1788, so lived in the 18th century, and he was a Swedish botanist. Carl Linnaeus loved plants. He spent his entire life traveling around Europe looking at plants. What he did with all these plants is he developed a modern system of classification, and he based this classification on plant reproductive structures. So what he did was he looked at the pistils and stamens, which are in the center of a flower, sort of in the middle of the petals, all those sort of things that come up in the middle, pistils, stamens, those are reproductive structures of plants. So he looked at the structure of those and classified them and wrote in 1735 this wonderful groundbreaking book called the Systema Naturae. Now, even though he's Swedish, Latin was the language of the day for scientists, so hence the Systema Naturae, the Latin title. Now, Carl von Linné, he based his system on morphology. Now, morphology is just a fancy word for structure, what something looks like. Our modern system of classification, we organize living things in a group based on their evolutionary relationships. So the way that we're able to base things on their evolutionary relationships, so how related things are, how long ago we branched off, we do this based on DNA. We do it based on DNA. And Clearly, DNA, modern technology, has allowed us to get a lot better at classifying than just looking at what something looks like, because it can be misleading if you're trying to just look at morphology or structure. Now, classification, organization of living things, the actual science of classification is called taxonomy. So taxonomy is the science, classification is what you're doing. So a person who studies classification, they would be a taxonomist. What Linnaeus contributed, his biggest contribution besides a hierarchy, was something called binomial nomenclature, which if we break this nice Latin word up, we get bi, which means two, nomial, meaning name, nomen, meaning name, and clature, system. So we have a two-name naming system. Now you are familiar with this. You may have heard it referred to as the scientific name. They're the exact same thing. Scientific names are based off of the system of binomial nomenclature. That's where they come from. Now, the one that you are probably most familiar with is Homo sapien, because it refers to you, me, and this lovely gentleman over here, Charles Darwin, with the fabulous beard. Now, binomial nomenclature are scientific names. What it is, this first word here, homo in our case, is the genus. The second word is sapien, that refers to the species. Now, when you look at the structure of this, the first letter of your genus is always capitalized, and the lowercase of the species is always lowercase. Always, always. It's incorrect if you capitalize both, and it's incorrect if you put both in lowercase. Now, if you're going to write these out on a computer, so if you're typing it, and I've shown you two examples here of our lovely friend over here. This is Canis domesticus, otherwise known as a pet dog. And this is a border collie, because that's the kind of dog I had growing up. So Canis domesticus on a computer would be capital genus, lowercase species, and italicized. Now, you cannot write italicized. There's no slanty writing to try and make up for italicized. Don't do it. What you do is uppercase genus, lowercase species, and you underline it. So now a comprehension check. See if you've been paying attention. First one, modern taxonomy bases the classification of organisms on their evolutionary relationships. What did Linnaeus base his original system of classification on? Good. Hopefully you were able to get that he based it on morphology, structure, based it on what things look like. All right, my second comprehension question for you. Which is more accurate, the modern classification system or Linnaeus' system? Good. Hopefully you were able to get that our modern system is more accurate because we're able to use genetic information. More advanced technology means we're able to be more specific about relationships. Last one for you in this one. So I have three scientific names. So I have the giant panda, polar bear, and the grizzly bear. I'm not going to try and pronounce those right now. So scientific names show relationships. So take a look at these scientific names, which are written in binomial nomenclature, and tell me which of these two organisms are more closely related. Good. Hopefully you were able to get that it is the polar bear and the grizzly bear. And the reason is because they both belong to the genus Ursus. Ursus right here. Now, if you look at our giant panda, I won't try and say this right now, you see that both the genus and species are different. But because they have the same genus, these two are more closely related.